The world is divided into four spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to today's program. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Coming up on the show, the Middle East is one of the most reported on areas of the world. In Israel, Palestine is often in the eye of the media storm. I'll speak with media analyst Danny Schechter about the most recent crisis and how to understand these events, which have seen Israel bombard the population of Gaza with military airstrikes. But first, a look at how English media have reported on Latin America. Researchers from Venezuela and Chile are concerned about how the media in Latin America, Europe, and the US perceive Venezuela. They point to a study suggesting that the majority of Venezuelan people perceive the actions of their former president, the now late Hugo Chavez, as positive, while the rest of the world classifies the actions of the Bolivarian government as negative. One explanation for the difference in perceptions between Venezuelans and the rest of the world is that they are the result of stereotypes or purported common sense. But the researchers worry that the views are shaped by what they call the hegemonic press. They have published their own recent study, Venezuela in the International Press, a biased coverage. For the study, they looked at 28 major newspapers in Latin America, Europe, and the US over a period of 1 year. They sampled 15,841 articles. The objective of their study was to determine whether or not there was a systematic bias against Venezuela. They found that 82% of the articles published about Venezuela presented a negative view of the country. The researchers proposed that a systematic negative bias such as this means that the right to information of citizens and readers is not being fulfilled. And now let's turn to our interview. Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel is under attack. These are just some of the messages being launched into the media war in the current Israeli-Palestinian crisis. The crisis began in mid-June when 3 Israeli teenagers went missing. Their bodies were found in the West Bank. And now Israeli airstrikes have hit more than 1,000 targets in Gaza, a strip of land that is about the size of the US District of Columbia, and that almost 2 million Palestinians call home. Deaths are now occurring at a rate of almost 200 Palestinians to 1 Israeli, and the situation is getting worse. Danny Schechter is a media analyst. He is an author and filmmaker and blogger. Welcome to the program, Danny.
Pleasure to be with you, Chris.
We hear and read a lot about Israel's right to defend itself. There's a social media campaign using the hashtag Israel under attack, and there was also a YouTube video explaining Israel's right to defend itself. What do they mean by this word defense, and how is it being used?
Well, every war is not just about military objectives. It's about propaganda impacts. Perception management is the word that people like to use today to try to kind of organize public opinion on your side, political support on your side, organizational support, and the like. And Israel has been a master of this through all 7 of its wars and other conflicts. It has been put as much effort into selling as telling. And in this case, in the conflict in Gaza, it has taken the high ground, basically saying, we're the ones that are being attacked, and not the people of Gaza. In other words, the facts are less important than the images. And in this case, the notion that Israel is under attack, even though it's the one doing the attacking, is one of the bizarre features of this and earlier conflicts.
Proportionality in terms of human suffering, with 200 Palestinian deaths to 1 Israeli, and in terms of power, the sheer military might of the Israeli airstrikes versus Gaza rockets. How do you make sense of these differences?
Well, obviously, war is not fair. And in this case, Israel is a modern state with an air force. Gaza is a colonized, a strip, as they call it, of land with very little support in the world. And so shooting at targets in Gaza is like shooting into a barrel of fish. You know, the people who have the guns are going to, you know, cause the most casualties. You know, Hamas is fighting back with rockets and showing a tenacity that it has the capacity to resist. But at this particular point, the rockets have not really had a big military impact in Israel, but it has had a psychological impact. So Israel's been unable to stop the rockets on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's been unable to conquer Gaza despite, you know, this incredible disparity in the use of power. So, but this is not an issue as long as the media doesn't make it an issue, and this is the important point. What's really going on may not have anything to do with how it's being covered. And in this case, most of the major New York or Washington-based media outlets are framing this issue the way Israel wants to see it framed. And as a consequence, Hamas is losing the media war. Israel is winning it. But in the world, which is more than just the Tel Aviv, Washington, New York axis, Israel is looking, you know, really more as the bully every single day in terms of the actions and the casualties there.
Right. I want to talk to you about this framing that you mentioned and how some facts are missing or other ones just inversed. And this current crisis, as you mentioned, began back in mid-June with the disappearance of the 3 Israeli teenagers. But the disappearance of Palestinian teenagers happens all the time. For example, the Census Department of the Palestinian Ministry of Detainees published its annual report in December 2013, stating that Israeli soldiers kidnapped 3,874 Palestinians. 931 of those were children. How do you begin to make sense of reports like this, and why aren't they anywhere in our mainstream media framework?
You know, it's a human rights abuse that's consistent with a whole history of human rights abuses and selective coverage in this particular conflict. The Israeli historian Ilan Pappé has written about this narrative, how this has always been the narrative. It's nothing new about it, about Israel pretending to champion, you know, freedom and the like, and always castigating, you know, its enemies in a way as barbarians or uncivilized and the like, whether or not they're children or adults. And so you have a pattern here. You have to look at this pattern, and it implicates and the American and Western media, which is very complicit in all of this. So it's up to you as a consumer of news to apply elementary principles of fairness and factual accuracy to this conflict as you would to any other.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on Imaginary Lines, Danny.
Thank you.
Now a look at more media-related news. In July, almost 40 journalists backed an open letter to President Barack Obama, published on the Society of Professional Journalists website, demanding an end to the suppression of news and information about federal agencies. Accusing the government of increasing censorship and hypocrisy, the journalist's letter said that the stifling of free expression is happening despite your pledge on your first day in office to bring a new era of openness to federal government. Contact between journalists and government departments, claimed the authors, has diminished over the past 2 decades. It has now reached a point where contact is often blocked completely unless it has been approved by public relations. Delays can stretch for days, longer than most deadlines allow. This is not a press versus government issue, the letter assured. This is about fostering a strong democracy where people have the information they need to self-govern and trust in governmental institutions. That's it for today's Imaginary Lines. Thanks for watching the show. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Please join me next week.